to exercise 533, which can be found in your textbook on page 216. In this example, we're going to talk about how to calculate departmental overhead rates and apply that overhead again to the production and calculate a variance. In this example, they give us information about what the company had estimated for the coming year. They have two different departments, the assembly department and the testing department. They give us that their overhead is estimated at $338,000 in the assembly department and $630,000 in the testing department. They then give us two different cost drivers, direct labor hours and machine hours. Be sure to pay attention to which department is using which type of driver to calculate their predetermined overhead rate. They tell us that for this company, the assembly department is going to be applied based on direct labor hours. The testing department, however, is going to be based on machine hours. That is very important information to pay attention to when calculating your predetermined overhead rate. Departmental overhead rates are calculated the same way as plant-wide overhead rates. You take the estimated overhead and divide it by the total estimated cost driver. The assembly department told us that they plan to have $338,000 in estimated overhead for the coming year. The problem also tells us that the assembly department bases their overhead rate on direct labor hours. Therefore, we would divide their total estimated overhead by only the direct labor hours that the assembly department plans to incur during the year. I want you to take a note here. Notice that we're only dividing by 130,000 direct labor hours rather than 170,000 direct labor hours that you find in the problem in the total column. We're only dividing it by how many direct labor hours the company plans to incur just in the assembly department. When we do that division, we come out that the assembly predetermined overhead rate is $2.60 per direct labor hour. We now need to do the same calculation for our second department, which is the testing department. Again, the information given to us in the problem tells us that is based on its estimated amount of overhead of $630,000. And in the testing department, our cost driver is machine hours. Again, when looking at the table of information in the problem, you will see that the testing department is estimating to incur 120,000 machine hours. We're only dividing it by how many machine hours the testing department plans to have. That gives us a predetermined overhead rate of $5.25 per machine hour. In part 2, they ask us to calculate the overhead that's applied to production in each department for the month of March. As a reminder, when you're doing any type of overhead rates, we only ever use our estimated amounts when calculating the predetermined overhead. We do not use them any other time in the problem. We use the estimated predetermined overhead rate and we multiply it by the actual amount of cost driver consumed in each department. Remember, when you're dealing with departmental overhead rates, you are typically going to be dealing with two different types of cost drivers. They tell us that the assembly department for the month of March incurred 11,700 direct labor hours. That's how many actual hours their direct laborers worked during that month. We're going to multiply that by our predetermined overhead rate of $2.60. That tells us that we applied in the month of March $30,420 in overhead to the assembly department. For the testing department, again, we use our predetermined overhead rate that was calculated in the previous part of $5.25, and we're going to multiply it by the actual amount of machine hours that the testing department used during the month of March. When we multiply the two, we see that we calculate $57,225 of overhead that we applied to the testing department in the month of March. In part 3, they want us to calculate how much each department's overhead was either over-applied or under-applied. They give us the actual amount of overhead that was incurred for each department. We list the actual overhead first. Again, remember, this is actual overhead, not estimated, of $29,850 for the assembly department and $58,000 for the testing department. We then use the applied overhead amounts that we calculated in part 2 to determine whether we are over-applied or under-applied in each department. For the assembly department, we are in fact over-applied. The amount of applied overhead exceeds how much we actually had in expenses during the month. For the testing department, we are under-applied. We applied less than what our actual costs were. Remember, always set up your overhead variance calculation in this way. Our actual overhead is listed first. We subtract away our applied overhead to get our variance. When you do that, it tells you how it's going to affect your cost of goods sold. So in our assembly department, we get a negative number, meaning that we were over-applied and we should subtract away $570 from cost of goods sold. However, in the testing department, it's a positive number, meaning that we were under-applied, our cost was too low, and we have to add $775 to cost of goods sold.